In 1718, the entire port of Charleston, South Carolina, ground to a halt. Ships sat paralyzed in the harbor. Merchants watched their cargo rot on the water. The colonial governor received a list of demands, and the man making them wasn't a foreign navy, wasn't a rival empire. He was one man with 4 ships and a reputation so precisely engineered that no one in Charleston seriously considered fighting back. He asked for a chest of medicine. That was it, a chest of medicine, in exchange for the hostages he'd taken from 9 vessels he'd stopped at will in open water. The colony paid. That's the thing about the pirates history actually remembers. The ones who lasted, who built something. Whether it was a fleet, a fortune, a legend, or an empire, were almost never the most violent men or women available. They were the ones who understood fear as a tool, who knew that a reputation, carefully built, was cheaper and more effective than a war. Every era of human civilization has produced pirates. Each era also produced one who stood above the rest, not just in body count or plunder, but in how completely they bent their world to their will. This is that story. 10 eras, 10 pirates, one consistent truth running underneath all of them. Start at the beginning, not with a single pirate, but with a fleet, and with a prisoner who made the worst first impression in the history of captivity. Around 75 BC, a young Roman aristocrat named Gaius Julius Caesar was sailing across the Aegean Sea when his ship was intercepted by Cilician pirates. The Cilicians, operating out of the rugged salt mountains of what is now southern Turkey, were not casual opportunists. They were, by that point, the most sophisticated maritime criminal organization the ancient world had ever produced. Plutarch puts their fleet at over 1,000 ships at peak strength. They had established ports, safe harbors, watchtowers, and intelligence networks. They raided coastlines from Greece to North Africa. They sold captives into the slave markets at Delos. Tens of thousands of people per year, by some ancient estimates. The Roman Republic, which prided itself on controlling the Mediterranean, had spent decades failing to stop them. Caesar was 25 years old and worth something. The Cilician set his ransom at 20 talents of silver, a significant sum. Caesar, by every account we have, laughed at them. He told them 20 talents was an insult, that he was worth at least 50, and instructed his companions to go raise the money. He then proceeded to spend the next 38 days as a captive, behaving as though he were in command of the ship. He joined the pirates' exercises. He slept when he wanted to, and demanded they be quiet when he didn't. He wrote poetry and speeches and read them aloud, and when the pirates didn't applaud with sufficient enthusiasm, he called them illiterate savages to their faces. He also told them, repeatedly, with apparent cheerfulness, that once he was free, he was going to come back and crucify every single one of them. They thought this was funny. A young Roman noble, their prisoner, threatening them. It was funny. The ransom was paid. Caesar was released. He immediately hired ships, caught most of the same Cilician crew before they could disperse, and brought them to the Roman magistrate at Pergamon, who declined to act quickly because the pirates were valuable and he intended to sell them himself. Caesar didn't wait. He went back to the harbor, took the Cilicians into his own custody, and crucified them. Everyone. He did have their throats cut first, as Plutarch notes, because he'd grown somewhat fond of them over 38 days, but crucified. As promised, the Cilicians themselves were not destroyed by Caesar. That came later under Pompey, in a systematic campaign in 67 BC that swept their fleet from the Mediterranean in 3 months. But the episode captures exactly what made the Cilicians the dominant terror of their era. They were organized where Rome expected chaos. They were patient where Rome expected recklessness. And they utterly misjudged a 25-year-old who would later rewrite the Roman world. The only pirate leader whose name survives with any clarity from this period is one the Romans called simply the Great One. Their commander during Pompey's campaign, a man named Heraclian, who commanded several hundred ships in the final engagement and lost. The Cilicians were the most feared maritime force of the ancient Mediterranean. They simply had the misfortune of existing in the same century as 2 of Rome's greatest generals. Several centuries north and forward in time, the nature of piracy changed entirely. The Vikings didn't think of themselves as pirates. They were raiders, traders, explorers, and occasionally all three on the same voyage. But from the perspective of every monastery on the English, Irish, and Frankish coastlines, the distinction was academic. The first recorded Viking raid on Britain was Lindisfarne, 793 AD. The monks described it as the end of the world. They were not being poetic. Of all the Norse figures who raided and terrorized the coasts of early medieval Europe, the one who stands out for sheer personal ferocity, documented specific and in his own words, is Egil Skallagrimsson. Egil was Icelandic, born around 910 AD, and he was, by any reasonable accounting, one of the most alarming human beings to have ever held a sword. He was also one of the greatest poets in Old Norse literature, which is the specific combination that makes him remarkable. We know him primarily through Egil's Saga, one of the Icelandic family sagas, written down in the 13th century, but drawing on oral tradition and, crucially, on poems that Egil himself composed, poems that survive verifiably his, and which contain details no later fabricator would have bothered inventing. Egil killed his first man at age 7. This is presented in the saga without particular alarm. He grew into a large, difficult, frequently drunk man who raided the coasts of Norway, England, and Courland, composed intricate skaldic verse about his experiences, and had a specific and personal problem with King Eric Bloodaxe of Norway, who outlawed him and tried several times to have him killed. When Egil was shipwrecked on the English coast and found himself in York, which Eric happened to be ruling at the time, as a client king under the English crown, his friend Arinbjorn gave him the night to compose a poem of praise for the king who wanted him dead, hoping it would buy his life. Egil spent the night writing Hovedlausen, head ransom, a 20-stanza praise poem technically magnificent enough that Eric, furious, let him live anyway. The poem survives. It is, by the standards of 9th and 10th century skaldic verse, exceptional. What made Egil feared wasn't the killing, though there was plenty of it. It was the specific quality of his anger, which was total and had no natural ceiling. He wasn't afraid of kings. He wasn't afraid of being outnumbered. At the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, fighting as a mercenary for the English king Ethelstan, his brother Thorfrolfr was killed. Egil's response was to go into the battle line personally and kill the Norwegian earl he held responsible, then continue fighting. Ethelstan gave him 2 chests of silver as compensation for his brother's death. Egil took the silver, sat down, and composed a poem. His capacity for grief and his capacity for violence occupied the same register. That was the thing people couldn't predict about him, and the thing they couldn't prepare for. He died in Iceland, old, nearly blind, by all accounts still difficult. He buried his silver somewhere on the landscape. The Sasa said he keyed 2 chests up to a hot spring and came back alone. No one has found it. The last image the saga gives us is Egil at a feast, throwing his money into the crowd to watch people scramble for it because he found the chaos pleasing. He was, the saga notes, not well liked at this point in his life. He didn't appear to mind. Moving 5 centuries forward and several hundred miles south, the Mediterranean produced another order of pirate entirely. One who made the leap from raiding to statecraft with a speed and completeness that no pirate before or since has matched. Hayreddin Barbarossa was born around 1478, probably on the island of Lesbos, the son of a Janissary soldier and a Greek woman. He and his brother Aruj began their careers as privateers in the eastern Mediterranean, technically operating under license from the Sultan of Egypt, practically operating for themselves, raiding Spanish and Italian shipping with considerable success. Aruj was the older brother and the original leader. He was also the more straightforwardly violent of the two, and he died violently, killed by Spanish forces in 1518 while trying to hold the city of Tlemcen in northwestern Algeria. Hayreddin inherited the operation. What he did with it was extraordinary. Rather than continuing as a freelance raider, he offered the entire Barbary Coast enterprise, the ports, the fleets, the networks, to the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in exchange for Ottoman protection and resources. Suleiman accepted. Hayreddin became Kapudan Pasha, Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet. From that position, he proceeded to dominate the Mediterranean for the next 2 decades. He captured Huitinis in 1534. He evacuated roughly 70 Moriscos from Spain to North Africa in 1529, a logistical operation of a scale most naval commanders of the era couldn't have conceived. At the Battle of Preveza in 1538, he commanded an Ottoman fleet against a combined Holy League force assembled by the Pope, Spain, Venice, and Genoa, and won decisively, securing Ottoman naval dominance of the Mediterranean for decades. The historian Roger Crowley calls Preveza one of the most consequential naval battles of the 16th century. The man who won it had started his career stealing cargo in the Aegean. Charles V of Spain, the most powerful monarch in Europe, reportedly offered Barbarossa vast wealth and territories if he would switch sides. Barbarossa declined. He died in Istanbul in 1546, in his home on the Bosphorus, reportedly at his own table. A death so peaceful it almost seems like a mistake for a man of his career. The Ottoman Navy fired a salute. Sailors in the harbor lowered their flags. He is the only pirate in history who ended up with a state funeral from an empire. Henry Morgan is, depending on your point of view, either the greatest pirate who ever lived or a man who was technically never a pirate at all. Morgan himself would have insisted on the second interpretation, and he was, for most of his career, legally correct. He operated under letters of marque from the English crown, which made him a privateer, licensed to attack Spanish shipping and territory on England's behalf. The distinction mattered enormously to him. It mattered somewhat less to the Spanish, whose cities he burned. Morgan was Welsh, born around 1635, and he arrived in the Caribbean sometime in the 1650s. By the 1660s, he was commanding raiding parties against Spanish settlements in Cuba and Central America. 1668 he sacked Portobello, one of the most fortified Spanish ports in the Americas, with a force of around 400 men. A feat so improbable that the Spanish governor of Panama wrote to him afterward, asking what kind of weapon he'd used, because surely no ordinary force could have done it. Morgan wrote back that he'd return and show him. He then spent 2 years making good on that. The attack on Panama City in 1671 is the event Morgan is remembered for. He led roughly 400 men across the Darien through some of the worst jungle terrain in the Americas. For 9 days, arrived at Panama City half-starved, and took it anyway. The city burned during the battle, either through Spanish sabotage or accident, and was destroyed. Morgan's haul was significant, though his men suspected him of undercounting the treasure to keep a larger share. They were probably right. The timing was catastrophic for Morgan politically. While he was crossing the Darien, England and Spain had signed the Treaty of Madrid, formally ending hostilities. Morgan's raid on a Spanish city in peacetime was a diplomatic incident. He was arrested, sent to London, and, in one of history's more remarkable administrative outcomes, knighted Sir Henry Morgan. Then sent back to Jamaica as lieutenant governor, where he spent the rest of his life prosecuting pirates. The privateers he'd once commanded became, under his jurisdiction, criminals. He died in Port Royal in 1688 of what his physician described as a dropsical condition, likely liver failure from decades of dedicated drinking. Port Royal was destroyed by an earthquake 4 years later. It dropped into the sea in 2 minutes. Morgan missed it, which, given his career, seems like the sort of luck that followed him everywhere. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, is the pirate everyone knows, and the reason everyone knows him is that he wanted it that way. This is the thing that separates Blackbeard from almost every other figure in the Golden Age of Piracy, which ran roughly from the 1690s to the 1730s and produced an unusual concentration of capable, ruthless, and strategically minded pirates working the Atlantic and Caribbean. Blackbeard was not necessarily the most dangerous fighter of his era. He was the most successful by total plunder. He was the most deliberately, systematically terrifying, and he understood, in a way that feels almost modern, that a sufficiently powerful reputation could do more work than a fleet. He started, probably, as a privateer during Queen Anne's War, operating out of Jamaica. When the war ended in 1713 and the Crown stopped issuing letters of marque, he moved into outright piracy, as did dozens of other privateers suddenly without legal employment. By 1716, he was operating under the pirate captain Benjamin Hornigold, and by 1717, he had his own command. He took the French slaving ship La Concorde in November 1717, retrofitted her with 40 guns, and renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge. He was now commanding one of the most heavily armed private vessels in the Atlantic. What he did with that firepower was, frequently, nothing, because the reputation was the point. Blackbeard grew his beard long, black, hence the name, and during battle or intimidation he reportedly wove slow-burning cannon fuses into it and lit them so that his face emerged from a cloud of smoke and sparks. The effect on sailors who had heard stories about him, which by 1718 was essentially all sailors on the Atlantic coast, was complete. Ships surrendered to him constantly without firing a shot. He preferred it that way. Combat was expensive, unpredictable, and damaged cargo. Fear was free. The Charleston blockade in May 1718, the one that opened this video, lasted about a week. Blackbeard stopped every ship entering or leaving the harbor, took prominent hostages including a member of the Colonial Council, and sent a delegation to the governor demanding a chest of medicines. The medicines were likely for treating syphilis among his crew, though the historical record is tactful on this point. The colony complied. Blackbeard released the hostages, kept their belongings, and sailed north. He was dead 6 months later. The Virginia governor, Alexander Spotswood, who had no jurisdiction over the waters where Blackbeard was anchored but dispatched a naval force anyway, sent Lieutenant Robert Maynard to find him in the shallows of Occoquan Inlet, North Carolina. The fight on November 22, 1718 was close and brutal. Blackbeard took 5 bullet wounds and around 20 sword cuts before he died. Maynard hung his head from the bowsprit of the sloop on the sail back to port. The legend was, of course, permanent by then. That was also the point. Blackbeard had been operating as a pirate for roughly 2 years. He'd accumulated relatively modest plunder by the standards of the era. What he'd built was a name that outlasted every ship he ever sailed. In October 1720, the British naval sloop HMS Tiger caught up with the pirate vessel commanded by John Rackham, known as Calico Jack, anchored off the coast of Jamaica. The Navy came alongside at night. Most of Rackham's crew was below decks, drunk. The few who came up to fight were 2 people, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. They held the deck alone while the men hid. When it was over, Bonny reportedly went below and told Rackham he ought to be ashamed, that he'd have fared better hanging than surrendering like this. He was hanged anyway, 12 days later. She was not particularly wrong. Anne Bonny had left her husband, a small-time sailor in Nassau, for Rackham sometime around 1719. She was Irish-born, raised in South Carolina, and by every contemporary account entirely uninterested in the conventions that were supposed to govern her life. Mary Read had been at sea for years before joining Rackham's crew. She'd served in the British military dressed as a man, fought in wars in Flanders, and arrived in the Caribbean through a sequence of events that reads like a novelist's invention, but is documented in Charles Johnson's A General, History of the Pirates, published in 1724, and drawing on trial records from their capture. Both women were pregnant when captured. Both were convicted of piracy at trial in Port Royal. Their sentences were respited on grounds of pregnancy. Mary Read died in prison in 1721, probably of fever. Anne Bonny's fate after that is unrecorded. She disappears from the historical record entirely, which, given her talent for disappearing into new identities, seems almost appropriate. They are included here not as a curiosity, not as a footnote about gender in the Golden Age. They are included because of what the moment on the deck of Calico Jack's ship actually reveals, that 2 women who had survived by being more capable than the people around them continued, even when outnumbered and outgunned, to be more capable than the people around them. The era's most feared pirates were not always the ones with the biggest fleet. Sometimes they were just the 2 people on the boat who showed up. The most successful pirate in recorded history operated not in the Caribbean but in the South China Sea, and she didn't start as a pirate at all. Xing Shi, name translates roughly as Widow of Zheng, was born around 1775, probably in Guangdong province, and was working in a floating brothel in Canton Harbor when she came to the attention of Zheng Yi, one of the most powerful pirate lords operating off the Chinese coast. They married in 1801. The marriage reportedly was negotiated by Qing Shi herself, and the terms included a formal partnership in the Pirate Confederation, not merely a social position. This detail tells you something important about how the next decade went. Zheng Yi commanded what was known as the Red Flag Fleet, a coalition of pirate vessels that had been growing in strength for years under his leadership. When he died in 1807, killed in a typhoon off the coast of Vietnam, the Confederation might have fragmented. Instead, Qing Shi took command. She did this by building an immediate political alliance with Zheng Yi's adopted son, Zhang Bao, who became her military commander, and later, her second husband. She then set about consolidating the Confederation with a systematic thoroughness that contemporary Chinese officials found genuinely alarming. At its peak, the Red Flag Fleet numbered somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800 vessels, and between 50,000 and 80,000 crew members. These are numbers that dwarf any other pirate enterprise in history by an order of magnitude. For scale, the Royal Navy, at the height of British imperial power, operated around 600 ships. Qing Shi was running a maritime empire roughly 3 times that size off the coast of Guangdong. And she was doing it with a written legal code, the Code, documented by the historian Diane Murray and Pirates of the South China Coast, governed everything. Crew members who disobeyed orders were flogged on the first offense. Theft from the common plunder was punishable by death. Desertion was punishable by having your ears cut off. Sexual violence against female captives was a capital offense, full stop. The code also specified that women taken as captives were to be treated as legitimate prizes of war, ransomed or released, not harmed. Murray's research suggests these rules were actually enforced, which is rarer than it sounds in the context of large criminal enterprises. The Chinese imperial government sent 3 naval expeditions to destroy the Red Flag Fleet between 1808 and 1810. All 3 were defeated. The Portuguese Navy, operating out of Macau, sent a squadron. It was largely captured. The British East India Company, whose merchant ships were being regularly targeted, lobbied the Chinese government to do something more effective. Nothing worked. What finally ended the Red Flag Fleet's dominance was a negotiated peace in 1810. Brokered with the Guangdong provincial government, Qing Shi negotiated the terms herself. Most of her fleet was absorbed into the Imperial Navy. Her commanders kept their ships and received officer commissions. She retained the plunder accumulated over her years of operation. She opened a gambling house in Canton. She died in 1844 at approximately 69 years old, surrounded by family. She is the only major pirate in history who retired voluntarily on her own terms with her fortune intact. Every government that tried to stop her failed. She stopped herself when she chose to because the deal was good enough. Jean Lafitte operated in a world where the line between pirate, privateer, patriot, and smuggler was not just blurry but actively useful, and no one exploited that blurriness with more skill than he did. Lafitte was born around 1780, probably in France, and arrived in New Orleans sometime in the early 1800s. By 1810, he was running a smuggling operation out of Barataria Bay, a network of barrier islands south of New Orleans, with his brother Pierre. They sold goods, much of it plundered from Spanish shipping, directly into the New Orleans market, which the merchants of New Orleans found extremely convenient, and the American territorial authorities found extremely difficult to stop. The Barataria operation at its height employed somewhere between 800 and 1,000 men and several dozen ships. Lafitte commanded it less as a pirate captain and more as a chief executive. He rarely sailed himself, preferring to manage operations from shore. He had a blacksmith shop in New Orleans as a legal front. He was, by contemporary accounts, charming, well-dressed, and fluent in several languages. The Louisiana Territorial Governor, William Claiborne, put a $500 bounty on his head. Lafitte responded by putting a $5 zero bounty on Claiborne's head. This was not the behavior of a man who felt cornered. In 1814, the British, at war with the United States, approached Lafitte with an offer. join their side, bring his fleet and his men, receive a commission in the Royal Navy. The British commander, Captain William Percy, offered him $30,000 and a captain's commission. Lafitte took the offer documents and delivered them directly to the American authorities in New Orleans, then offered his services to the United States instead. His reasons were probably not purely patriotic. A British victory would have complicated his smuggling operation considerably, but the result was the same. At the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815, his men served under Andrew Jackson and were, by Jackson's own account, in official correspondence, instrumental in the American victory. Jackson called them the Corsairs of Barataria in one letter, then gentlemen in the next, which was a significant upgrade. After New Orleans, the American government pardoned Lafitte and his men. He promptly returned to piracy, operating under a Venezuelan privateer commission out of Galveston Island, Texas. The American Navy eventually pressured him out of Galveston in 1820. He disappeared from reliable record shortly afterward. The circumstances of his death are genuinely unknown. One account places it off the coast of Central America around 1823. Another has him surviving into old age and obscurity. He left no confirmed descendants, no verified grave, and a city in Louisiana that named a parish after him anyway. Two governments asked Jean Lafitte for help. He helped one, took the other's documents, and went back to piracy. That's a career. Shapansai is a name that appears in relatively few popular histories of piracy, which is an oversight because at his peak in the late 1840s, he commanded a fleet of somewhere between 70 and 180 armed junks operating in the South China Sea and the Gulf of Tonkin. Numbers that made him, in terms of active naval strength, more powerful than several legitimate governments in the region. He raided coastal settlements in southern China, attacked European merchant shipping, and proved largely impervious to the interdiction efforts of the weakened Qing dynasty, which was dealing with considerably larger problems during this period. What finally brought the British Navy into active pursuit was a series of attacks on vessels flying British flags. The East India Company's marine operations and the Royal Navy's China Squadron began coordinating against him in 1849. The operation that resulted was one of the largest anti-piracy military actions in the 19th century. A combined British and Chinese imperial force, the Chinese for once willing to cooperate because they wanted him gone as badly as anyone, chased Shapansai's fleet into the Gulf of Tonkin and engaged it at the Battle of Tonkin in October 1849. The engagement lasted several days. British steam vessels had a decisive advantage over sail-powered junks in the confined waters of the Gulf. By the end, somewhere between 700 and 800 pirates were dead and dozens of junks had been destroyed or captured. Shapansai himself escaped. This detail is significant. The Royal Navy deployed its China Squadron against him, coordinated with Imperial Chinese forces, fought a multi-day naval battle, and the man himself got away. He subsequently surrendered to Chinese authorities and, in the manner of the era, offered a position in the imperial military rather than execution, a practical arrangement that the Qing government used regularly with pirate leaders they couldn't fully defeat. He disappears from the historical record shortly afterward, presumably serving in some provincial naval capacity. The battle that was meant to end him killed nearly 2,000 of his men and inconvenienced him personally. The final entry in this sequence is the only one still within living memory, and it requires a different frame entirely. Muhammad Abdi Hassan, known as Afwain, meaning big mouth in Somali, was not a pirate in the classical sense. He didn't command ships personally. He didn't navigate, fight, or board vessels. What he did was organize, finance, and systematize maritime piracy off the coast of Somalia on a scale that briefly made it one of the most significant criminal enterprises on Earth. Afwain came from the Mudug region of central Somalia, a former government employee who had worked in fisheries regulation, a detail that sounds darkly comic until you consider that the collapse of the Somali state in the early 1990s had exposed Somali fishing waters to massive illegal trawling by foreign fleets, devastating local fishing communities. The men who eventually became pirates were, in many cases, former fishermen who had watched their livelihoods destroyed by foreign industrial fishing and had also noticed that those same foreign vessels were extremely difficult to protect in open water. The grievance was real. What Afwain built on top of it was a criminal enterprise. By the mid-2000s, Somali piracy had developed into a structured business. Afwain's operation, the Somali Marines, later other affiliated groups, used speedboats to intercept container ships and tankers in the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean. Captured crews were held in Somali ports as hostages while ransoms were negotiated. The negotiations were conducted professionally, often through specialist maritime insurers and hostage negotiators in London. Ransoms ran into the millions of dollars per vessel. In 2008, the supertanker MV Sirius Star, a vessel carrying 2 million barrels of Saudi oil, worth over $100 million, was taken approximately 450 nautical miles off the Kenyan coast. The ransom paid was $3 million. Afwain's operation at its peak was generating tens of millions of dollars annually. The international response was extraordinary in scale and largely ineffective. NATO deployed warships. The European Union launched Operation Atalanta. The United States, China, Russia, India, and over 24 other navies sent vessels to the Gulf of Aden. The area patrolled was roughly the size of Western Europe. Piracy rates dropped from 2011 onward as naval presence increased, but Afwain himself remained untouched. He was caught, ultimately, not by a navy but by a Belgian sting operation in 2013. Belgian federal police, working with Somali authorities, offered Afwain and his son a role in a documentary about piracy. They flew to Belgium. They were arrested at Brussels airport. He was convicted in 2016 and sentenced to 27 years, the longest sentence ever handed to a Somali pirate. He was 63 years old. The most sophisticated naval coalition in modern history couldn't catch him. A film crew did. Step back across all 10 of these, from the Cilicians in the Aegean to Afwain in Brussels, and the pattern that holds is consistent enough to be the point. The pirates who defined their eras were not simply the most willing to use force. Every era produced plenty of those, and most of them died broke or early or both. What separated these 10 was a quality closer to institutional thinking. The Cilicians built infrastructure. Barbarossa built a navy. Morgan built legal cover. Ching Shi built a code. Afwain built a supply chain. Blackbeard built a brand. Even Egil Skallagrimson, the most personally, chaotically violent of the group, built a reputation precise enough that kings calculated the cost of fighting him before they decided whether to try. Fear across every one of these eras was the product. The method of manufacturing it changed with the century. The underlying logic never did. If you want more from this corner of history, click the video on screen now